In the last video, I explained what humanism was, and I explained the differences, what's changing about education as we enter the Renaissance period. And in this video, I'm going to talk about some of the early leaders of the Renaissance. So we're going to begin with Francesco Petrarch. Francesco Petrarch was one of the leaders who perhaps did the most to drive the early Renaissance and to drive early humanism. Petrarch was born in Florence in 1304. And his family was exiled from the city when he was still a young man. And when he was 8, his family moved to a small village near Avignon. And the reason that they moved near Avignon was because of the Avignon papacy. I think it's always cool to see how these different topics that we're studying in the class connect with each other. And his father was working in an administrative position for the papacy. And so Petrarch comes from a literate family, and we're told that his father would read aloud the letters of Cicero at night, and this practice encouraged Petrarch's interest in classical writing. So here's the continuity with the medieval period here. This isn't something that comes from nothing. Petrarch has this interest already in the study of in the study of classical reading and writing and classical knowledge. When Petrarch was 12, he was sent to Montpellier, which was the leading university in southern France, and he was sent there to study law, which he hated, and so he took as few classes in law as he could and devoted himself to studying Latin. Then, after he had finished his preliminary studies in Montpellier, he was sent to Bologna, which was the leading law school in Europe. And so, even though he wasn't spending a lot of time studying the law, he was obviously very talented enough to gain admission to the best law school, at least in Europe at that time. When his father died in 1324, however, he decided to return to Avignon and to study ancient texts and to write poetry. And so he seized with a desire to discover ancient texts, to disseminate them to a wider audience, and to use this as a means for understanding humanity and understanding human nature. And so here we can see this idea, or the ideas that underpin humanism, coming to the fore here. And so initially, Petrarch struggles to find employment, but eventually is acclaimed as Italy's finest poet after he writes an epic poem about the Second Punic War. He's writing about Scipio and Hannibal and Rome surviving this existential threat. And he does much to encourage the study of ancient Roman literature. He works primarily in Latin. We have these accounts of him writing letters to the authors of the past, writing a letter, dear Cicero, dear Virgil. And he tried to also learn Greek, but this was not accessible really to him at the time. And so this is what's interesting about Petrarch, that at once we can see how he is a continuity with the medieval period. His father read and enjoyed Cicero. He passes that love on to his son Petrarch. On the other hand, some aspects of the ancient world are just not accessible. In fact, basically anything that had not been translated from Greek into Latin was not accessible to thinkers of this time. Petrarch was also interested in the writings of St. Augustine. You'll see this in the reading from Petrarch that you're going to discuss this week. He sees Augustine, who famously led a very dissolute life as a young man and then had a very powerful conversion experience to Christianity. Petrarch sees Augustine in some ways as the ultimate humanist, as someone who embraced self-improvement over time. And Petrarch left behind a legacy that would shape the Renaissance, a fascination with ancient literature and the study of ancient literature, a desire to communicate and to engage with the people of the past, Virgil and Cicero and Augustine, and an awareness of history, an awareness of the importance of understanding history for understanding human nature. So this is the story of Francesco Petrarch. Now we move on to the study of Giovanni Boccaccio. Boccaccio, who you can see is roughly a contemporary with Petrarch. He lived a little longer. He was the son of a Florentine merchant who was born in Paris, where his father was traveling at the time. Again, this is just another sign of the times. We talked about how important merchants are in the society. We talked about how trade is increasingly a long distance occupation, long distance trade, long distance trading networks are developing, and Boccaccio is a product of that. Like Petrarch, he studied law, but he also studied banking in the University of Naples. That was another very prestigious and ancient university, but he enjoyed neither. With the Black Death and the Hundred Years' War, the banking job that he had taken collapsed, and he returns back to Florence inspired to write by the experience of the Black Death. So here we see whereas Petrarch received his inspiration from his father, Boccaccio receives it from the events that are going on around him. And so he's inspired to write the Decameron, and the Decameron is an account of these people who leave the city of Florence because of the Black Death. They go into the countryside to get away from the disease, and while they're in this countryside retreat, they tell stories to pass the time. And so it's very much the case that Boccaccio's interest in literature, his construction of literature, is highly influenced by the Black Death. Another way in which Boccaccio was a little bit distinct from Petrarch was that he promoted the study of Greek. Now, he is still, there's a lack of access, there's a lack of tutors, there's a lack of people who know Greek in this society. So as far as we know, Boccaccio doesn't learn Greek himself, but he pays for classes to be taught in Greek at the University of Florence. This is a way of continuing to promote and expand access to the writings of the ancient world. He collected manuscripts, and he wrote a series of biographies of famous women. And so these are Boccaccio's great contributions to the Renaissance. He shows us how important it was for Renaissance thinkers, for the early humanists to study the ancient literature of the past, but also how some of the rise of humanism and Renaissance learning is influenced by the Black Death. Now, as I've sort of hinted at already, it's fair to say that the study of classical learning was never going to be complete until it was possible to learn Greek. So what Petrarch is doing with Latin, what Boccaccio is doing with Latin is very impressive. They have access to the works of the ancient Roman philosophers, historians, authors, and to some of the Greek texts that have been translated into Latin. So Aristotle's philosophy, for example. But there's a whole branch of the wisdom and the literature of the ancient world that was written originally in Greek that hadn't been translated into Latin, that was inaccessible to people like this. And so Boccaccio is going to sponsor the learning of Greek and the study of Greek in Florence, and this is going to move the Renaissance forward and open up access to more texts at this time. And the man who does so much to bring this about is a Greek named Emanuel Chrysorous. And he is the one who's going to bring knowledge of Greek to Renaissance Italy. So Emanuel Chrysorous was from an old and wealthy Greek family. And according to his family's legends, his family had moved east in the 4th century, so about 1,000 years before, from Rome to Constantinople, when the capital of the ancient Roman Empire was moved to Constantinople by Constantine. Now, as we enter the 15th century, the Byzantine Empire was weakening. And so he comes to Florence to teach Greek in 1395. And he must have been an inspiring teacher because of the huge number of students who become great writers and great teachers as a result of his influence. Now, people in Western Europe have not seriously been studying Greek for about 700 years at this point. And so Chrysorous in some ways is starting from scratch. But he brings the works of Homer, so the Iliad and the Odyssey, these works that are seen as foundational Western literature. He translates these works from Greek into Latin, makes it much more accessible for people living in Italy at the time. And he also translates the works of Plato. So some of Plato's philosophy, people had access to that, but some of it they didn't. And so Chrysorous makes this possible as well. So that's Chrysorous, and in the next video we'll talk a little bit about some of his students.